The world is divided into four spheres, each sphere divided among continents and nations. Nations are divided by borders and interests. These interests divide the news. We examine the impact of these divisions on people and power. This is Imaginary Lines. Welcome to the program. I'm your host, Chris Spanos. Coming up on the show, the story is often told that ISIL, the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant, emerged from the sectarian conflicts plaguing Iraq. I'll speak with journalist Arun Gupta about this narrative. But first, a look at how English media have reported on top Latin American news. The Washington Post published an editorial on July 26th, touting its plan to help the children of Central America, who have been leaving behind their families in record numbers to make the dangerous journey to the United States. Their solution is to export to Honduras the multi-billion-dollar counter-narcotics and counterinsurgency program known as Plan Colombia, implemented by the United States in 2000. Calling Plan Colombia one of the great bipartisan success stories of recent U.S. foreign policy, the Washington Post cites the military aid program as the reason for Colombia's lower crime rates in recent years. But the paper fails to note what the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists pointed out in 2001, that protection of U.S. oil and trade interests formed a major part of the aid package. The Washington Post also omits the grave human rights abuses that were committed during the time of Plan Colombia, and the close links that tied then Colombian President Alvaro Uribe to right-wing death squads in the South American nation. The use of paramilitary death squads to enforce U.S. foreign policy is nothing new in Latin America. This is even more so in the case of Honduras, where the Washington Post is advocating the implementation of a military plan similar to that of Colombia. In the 1980s, Honduras served as training grounds for the Nicaraguan Contras, which the Reagan administration used to destabilize the Sandinista government in the neighboring country. The Contras were schooled in torture and terror techniques by the CIA and have contributed to the instability and poverty of the region, which is behind the immigration issue. And now let's turn to our interview. From Forbes magazine to CBS News, Washington has often used the media as a platform to tell us how Iraq is devolving into a sectarian civil war. And now ISIL, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, have declared a caliphate, a new state that doesn't recognize the borders of either Iraq or Syria. Arun Gupta has written for Al Jazeera, The Guardian, and In These Times. Most recently, he wrote The Return of Frankenstein about the narrative of sectarianism in Iraq for Telesur English. Hi, Arun. Welcome to Imaginary Lines.
Thanks for having me.
Media have portrayed the rise of ISIL with the simultaneous collapse of the Iraqi state. Take us back to the beginning of this story and explain how this narrative has evolved.
Well, the thing to really understand about the conflict in Iraq is that, one, it's been going on for decades. Of course, the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003, but we also need to recall that for over 2 decades before that, the U.S. had been intimately involved in Iraq. There was the 1991 Persian Gulf War, then the sanctions, which were highly questionable, if not downright illegal under U.S. Under international law. So we've really been at war with Iraq for over 20 years. So this is part of the narrative that gets completely lost. Now, a lot of this changes in 2003 when the U.S. occupies Iraq, because what it did was it used sectarian directly as a tool to try to control the population. The mindset of the Bush administration was to view the Sunni Arabs as basically the bulwark of Saddam Hussein's regime, even though that really wasn't true. They did benefit disproportionately, but Hussein wasn't playing the sectarianism card in the way that the U.S. would wind up playing it. So the policy essentially was to punish the Sunni Arab. And so essentially the U.S. created the conditions for the insurgency because it alienated alienated about 500,000 Iraqis.
One of the protagonists in Washington's story is Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. How does he fit into the picture?
Well, the U.S. helped engineer his rise to power. So after an insurgency starts to take root, what the U.S. did is the Pentagon is not skilled in nation building, and it imposed a very brutal occupation, arrests, rounding up, the Abu Ghraib and all these other torture centers it created. And this only stoked the insurgency. The next U.S. response was to create these sectarian death squads. But in 2005, it basically staged elections. Eventually, there were other elections held a couple of years later where the U.S. wanted to oust the prime minister at the time, Ibrahim al-Jafari, because he was seen as too close to the populist Shia cleric Muqtada al-Sadr, who represented the poor in Baghdad. And so they helped to bring Maliki to power. They are the ones who are training his army, arming it, providing military advisors. The U.S. has the largest, its largest embassy in the world is in Baghdad, and it's strongly suspected that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of CIA agents and intelligence officials operating out of the U.S. embassy there. There's also thousands of military contractors. The U.S. is still very much the dominant force in Iraq. So when it tries to maintain this is just a sectarian war, we should be highly suspicious of that. Sectarianism is just a way to whitewash the U.S. occupation and domination in Iraq.
Arun, I want to try to bring this full circle. You've described a situation where the U.S. has helped create conditions that have enabled the rise of sectarianism in Iraq and in the broader region. And I'm wondering about what your concerns are about this for the future of fundamentalism around the world.
You know, I don't think people are by nature religious fanatics. You know, they may adopt these ideology because they're frustrated in all these other avenues. And so the U.S. had destroyed the economy. It had destroyed the ability for hundreds of thousands of people to engage in any sort of economic activity for them and their family. It created these conditions, and so it created the conditions for the rise of this violent religious fundamentalism. And so my fear is that what we're doing is we're creating a new Frankenstein in the Middle East, one that is much more capable, more violent, has far more resources than Al-Qaeda ever did. And as someone who lives in New York and watched with my own eyes what happened on September 11th, this gives me great concern that we haven't learned anything, and we're creating the conditions for a much more violent blowback, a much more vicious monster that is going to turn on us.
Well, thank you very much for helping us understand this narrative and for joining me on Imaginary Lines, Arun.
Thanks for having me.
And now a look at other media-related news. As tensions between the West and Russia increase, mainstream media are struggling to prove Russian backing of the Eastern rebels. Accusations have been massing since the downing of Malaysian flight MH17, which the EU and the US allege indirect responsibility to Moscow. On Friday the 25th, the New York Times released pictures which allegedly showed Russian gunmen fighting in Ukraine. Later, it was revealed that the pictures were posted by a photographer on Instagram, who clarified that all of the pictures were taken in Ukraine and all men were Ukrainian. The U.S. ambassador to Ukraine posted on his Twitter account satellite images supposedly showing Russian artillery being fired into Ukraine. As a Russian official said, the image's authenticity is impossible to determine due to the absence of the attribution to the exact area and an extremely low resolution. But as Western mainstream media are now pushing to convince their audiences that Russia is backing Ukrainian rebels and could soon invade the neighboring country, the same claims have been made by Ukrainian media since March this year. For example, the pro-governmental Kyiv Post has been announcing an imminent Russian invasion, echoing military officials. The media watchdog, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, has investigated the New York Times coverage around claims that Russia is backing Ukrainian rebels. They conclude that the Times doesn't seem to have the evidence to back up its claims of Russian management of the separatist movement or uprisings. That's it for today's Imaginary Lines. Thanks for watching the program. I'm your host, Chris Spanos. Please join me next week.